Welcome to Drippings from the Honeycomb, the official podcast of Another 12 Ministries. We are so glad that you have decided to join us as we enjoy the sweetness of God's Word, one verse at a time. Hello and welcome to episode 11 of our journey through the first 11 or so books of Genesis. This is our final episode of season 4, and while we're not going to go all the way through the 11th chapter of Genesis, this really will cover up to the end of chapter 10, because that's where the story of Noah ends, and that really concludes this first part of the book of Genesis. After this, you're going to get into the story of Abraham and how God selects the Jews to be his chosen people. And from there, that's a whole nother story that we'll have to tackle in a different season of the podcast. So today we're going to tie up what we've been talking about for the last 11 episodes and really put a conclusion on this beautiful relationship between God and man that is so clearly spelled out here in the very beginning of the first book of the Bible. And I don't know if you have noticed a pattern that has begun to occur over the last few verses that we have looked at, and is really going to conclude in the passage that we're going to look at today. But that is a detailed back and forth between God and man. In episode 8, we see God's first interaction with Noah, how he commands him to build the ark. He tells them that he's going to bring this destruction on the earth. He tells him he's going to wipe out the people of the earth and start over, and he commands him to build the ark, gives him all the instructions, and ultimately would bring him all of these animals to put on the ark and tell him to put his family on the ark. And then we come to episode 9. And what we see in episode 9 is that Noah did all that God commanded him. So God starts with giving instructions to the faithful family, the faithful followers that are on the earth. And the faithful followers demonstrate their faithfulness by obeying God. And then in episode 10, we saw how God didn't forget his faithful followers who had obeyed his commands out on the floodwaters in the middle of their desperation, in the middle of this terrible circumstance that they are living through. God remembers them. And so when these faithful followers experience the salvation that God has in store for them, when they come out of the ark, when the flood is over and God has brought them through this terrifying ordeal, we now run into the passage that we're going to look at today, and that is Noah's response. And this is very indicative of how we as believers should respond to God. God has commanded all people to worship him. He has commanded all people to follow him, to serve him, to obey him. Man's response should be humble obedience to God, worship of God, acknowledgement of who God is, confession of sin. God's response to man's humble obedience, God's response to man's worship, God's response to man's repentance is salvation. Now, he's already provided a path of salvation, but the application of salvation is given to those who believe. That's Jesus' ministry. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So we see that God responds to those who obey him, who obey his call to make him the Lord of their life. And then what does that do? Well, that drives those who have repented, who have received this great salvation from the Lord, to worship him more. And this beautiful exchange, this give and take between God and man, it so cements the idea that we have a relational God. We have a God that loves us. We have a God that wants to be with us. We have a God that created us for his good pleasure. I think sometimes those words kind of roll off our tongue. They sound a bit old-fashioned. They sound Old English almost. But the reality is there's a tremendously deep theological meaning in those words. Man was created for God's good pleasure. When you create something for your good pleasure, you don't need that thing. You don't need whatever it is that you created for your good pleasure. You created it purely because it brings you joy. We are created as human beings purely because we bring God joy. We worship him, and that brings him joy. He has relationship with us, that brings him joy. He does things for us, that brings him joy. We were created for God's good pleasure. And so when we understand this, it creates a response from us. And so we find Noah here in Genesis 8, verse 21 and 22. Noah has just experienced this incredible event, a year floating around on the waters of the ark. He's experienced horrific loss, losing every other person on earth. Conceivably, he'd lived 500 years or more at this point. He's known many of these people who are now dead. And yet, after the salvation of the Lord, bringing him through this, bringing his family through this, setting him up as almost like a second Adam, he's restarting civilization. This is his response. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intentions of man's heart is evil from his youth. Never will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. God is not expressing regret for bringing the flood on the earth. Do not see God's statement here as any form of weakness, any form of looking back, any form of, oh no, I just realized the consequences of what I did and now I wish I hadn't. No, that's not what he's saying. What God is saying here is, I have brought judgment on the earth, just judgment. And now I will exercise mercy on the earth. This is an incredible thing. This is an incredible statement that God makes. He sees the worship of Noah. He experiences the worship of Noah in the sweet savoring, the sweet smell of the offering that Noah brings. And he says, I will have mercy. We're going to enter a new phase. We're ushering in a second era, if you will. And God is now going to pursue his plan of redemption for mankind all the way to Jesus Christ on the cross. But the point is that man was created by God for his good pleasure. And God honors that. God honors Noah's sacrifice. God honors Noah's worship. God looks at what he has done in terms of the judgment and says, it is enough. I will stay my judgment. I will grant mercy. And during this time when I'm granting mercy, my judgment is going to be building up. It's going to be pent up because I can't turn away from sin. I have to judge sin. I have no choice. I'm a holy and righteous God. But the next time I judge sin, the next time I exact a death penalty for sin, it will be on the body and person of my own son. That is amazing. That is such an incredible truth. Now, of course, Noah just lived through this horrifying event. He just witnessed the most cataclysmic event ever to strike the earth. And God reassures him that this won't happen again. Because you have to think that in Noah's mind, he understands human hearts. He understands how evil human hearts are. But God is going to put his mind at ease. Because I'm sure in the back of Noah's mind, he's thinking, well, this is going to happen all over again. We're going to multiply. We're going to have children. And in 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, who knows? Maybe God will be fed up with us again and he's going to wipe out the earth again. But God says, no, I'm going to have mercy now. And so he says, while acknowledging that man's heart is evil from his youth, God doesn't give on that. Man's heart is evil. We know this. Through the sin of Adam and Eve, man becomes evil. He falls. But God reassures Noah and says, I won't strike down the earth again. In fact, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. This should be a massive comfort to those who are believers. Until Jesus returns, judges the world, burns the world, recreates the world, puts the believers on the world, and brings heaven down to the earth so that his dwelling will be with men, nothing will stop the seasons. Nothing will stop the food from growing on the earth. Nothing will stop the rotation of the earth. So whenever you, as a believer, hear a doomsday person saying that this is going to cause an end to the earth, or that's going to cause an end to the earth, or some man-made instrument is going to cause, all food to be gone from the face of the earth, take comfort in this verse, because God is the God of the earth. God is Lord over all. And he has said in a solemn covenant to his servant Noah that while the earth remains, in other words, unless God intervenes and supernaturally destroys the earth, which he has promised not to do until the end of time, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. That doesn't mean we won't have hard times. That doesn't mean there won't be natural disasters. But it does mean that life on the earth will go on as it has gone on since Adam first walked the earth until Jesus puts an end to the earth. Nothing can stop it. Nothing can alter it. God is sovereign. And that's a huge comfort for those of us who live here on the earth. And you can see even in this ongoing dialogue that we've looked at in the last few episodes between God and man, that God always gives the final response. Even here where we talk about Noah building an altar, Noah builds the altar and worships God for his salvation, and then God lavishes blessing. God extends out of his own vast resource, out of his immeasurable love and mercy and generosity, extends a blessing to man. God does not have to do it. See, if man was created for God's good pleasure and man was created to worship God, then God could end the story right here. Case closed. God is God, man is man, man owns worship to God. That's it. But that's not where God ends it, because that's not who God is. God is a loving God. He is a generous God. He created man for his own good pleasure, and he loves to bless his creatures. This brings joy to God, and so he extends this blessing to Noah. And if we were to keep reading, if we were reading this passage together and we were to keep reading, we would eventually come down to Genesis 9:16, where God causes Noah to look up into the clouds, and there Noah sees a rainbow. And God says this, "When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh on the earth." Notice it doesn't say, when you see the rainbow in the cloud, you can remember what I said. No. God says when he sees the bow in the clouds. In other words, every single time the clouds cover the earth, because we know that rainbows occur all the time, whether we see them or not. So whenever this rainbow occurs over the earth, in other words, whenever it's raining out, whenever there's clouds out, whenever there is weather on the earth, weather which is potentially drastically changed by the flood and the way things happened, God will see this bow in the clouds and remember. Now remember, if you listened to a few episodes ago, God doesn't remember because he forgets. Remembering means he never forgets. God will always remember his covenant. It's an everlasting covenant. So God will never forget his covenant between God and every living creature. In other words, God holds that covenant in his hand. It is secure. It can never, ever, ever be changed. It can never be broken. Why? Because God cannot violate himself. He cannot violate his words. He cannot go against himself. It's impossible. Or he wouldn't be God. He couldn't be who he claims to be if he ever went against himself. And this is really the story of the first few chapters of Genesis. It's the story of man failing, God stepping in and making a way, some men, women, children obeying and carrying on the godly line, and God remaining faithful to them. Even though he doesn't have to do anything more for them, even though them being in his presence, in a relationship with him, reaping the blessing of just being with the Almighty and being in a saving relationship with him, he decides to go beyond that. He decides to go past that and bless them in an insane way. And it's just a picture of what he was going to do all along. It's a picture of what Jesus is going to do for his church. It's a picture of what God the Father is doing for those who put their faith and trust in Jesus, for us. It's not enough to just save us in his eyes. It's not enough to just create a new earth for us to be on. It's not enough for us to just be in his presence. He wants to be where we are. You see, God and Jesus throughout the scriptures referred to themselves as a groom, a bridegroom, and their followers as the bride. When a man loves his wife, loves his bride, he doesn't just want to have her come live with him. He doesn't just want her to be his wife in name. He doesn't just want her to raise a family with him or to help share the burden of this life. He wants to be in her presence all the time. He wants to fellowship with her on an intimate level of body, soul, and spirit, like he'll fellowship with no other person. And the bride desires the same thing. The bride mirrors those sentiments and also puts out those sentiments of her own will. And the groom mirrors the bride's sentiments. You see, it's a constant two-way picture of love and fellowship and desire to be together, unending. That doesn't mean that husbands and wives don't annoy one another sometimes and irritate one another sometimes. And why is that? Well, it's because of sin. But see, with the church and our bridegroom, we can never cause Jesus to not want to be with us. Now, sometimes we as sinful Christians will read the word and we'll actually push back against God. We'll say, no, God, I don't like that. That's uncomfortable. Or God will call us to do something and we'll push back. We'll say, no, God, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go there. That's not what I want. But see, that's only one direction, because our sin doesn't impact God's love for us. Our sin doesn't impact his desire to be with us. That's why he died on the cross. And so just like God unilaterally upholds the covenant here in Genesis 9:16, where he says, I'm putting my bow in the clouds, and when I see it, I'll remember, and I will uphold the covenants. He's all God-focused. Same with Jesus. Jesus loved us before he died for us. While we were still sinners, he died for us. It's all God. It is all him. It is all him reaching out to us. And our response to him is a mirroring of his affections to us. And so when we pour out worship to him, we're merely giving back to him what he has shown us, is that we were made for his good pleasure. We were made for relationship with him. We were designed for fellowship with him, and he enjoys our company, and we will never have joy unless we are in his company. I'll say that one more time because it's important for us to understand that. We were made for him. He enjoys our company, and we will never have joy unless we are in his company, because we were made for his good pleasure. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Drippings from the Honeycomb. If you would like to learn more about Another 12 Ministries and the work that we are doing to train ministry leaders to bring the gospel to all people, visit another12.org. If you would like to support our ministry, click on the donate link in the description below.